Welcome everybody to this webinar series, Reaching New Heights, and to this particular session, which is all about developing yourself. I'm delighted that you have joined us this morning. My name is Dave McKeown, and I am your moderator for today. I'm also the CEO of Outfield Leadership, which is a strategic planning and leadership development consulting company. And it's my pleasure to take us through the session. Before we get stuck in, however, I'm going to share a short video with you that lays out the vision for these next 3 webinars. All right, folks, hearing from you in the group chat that you can't hear the audio, for which I apologize. I will see what I can do to fix that before we get to the end of our session. Rather than me finagle around on a technical detail, let's just plow on forward. I am going to share my screen and we're going to get stuck in because we have a lot to cover today. Let me just share my screen. And if you could let me know in the group chat if you can see the slides in front of you, that would be awesome. Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Janet, Margaret. Awesome. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Okay. Like I said, my name is Dave McKeown. Delighted to be here for this series, which is called Reaching New Heights. And over the next 3 45-minute webinars, we are going to have a number of speakers that are going to help you develop yourself, build your team, and tell your story. And today, particularly, we're going to look at how to develop yourself. These sessions have been put together by 2 fantastic organizations, and I just want to take a minute to share with you about those organizations. The first organization is ECofOC, Executive Coaches of Orange County, of which I'm a proud volunteer. And ECofOC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's been helping the community since 2002. Its mission is to develop nonprofit leaders and managers through individual coaching. We've got no paid staff or office, and coaching is provided at no charge. We have 60 diverse coaches, and we serve over 225 coaching clients. And we also run executive director forums, which is peer-to-peer coaching solutions with groups of 12 executive directors, facilitated by 2 of our coaches, and they're excellent. If you're not part of the ECofOC and you'd like to find out more about how to get some coaching, feel free to go over to ecofoc.org. The second organization that's helped pull this together is the Nonprofit Collaborative of Southern California, and they help their nonprofit client base achieve greater stability across additional platforms. They're a team of top professionals in the nonprofit sector, and they have a huge combined knowledge that cover a bunch of critical areas like HR, accounting, legal, IT, risk management, public relations, marketing, insurance, transitional management, and evaluation sustainability. Basically anything that you need to run your nonprofit. And over the last couple of weeks and months, these 2 organizations, certainly members from both, have come together to pull together this webinar series, which we're hoping will help you as a leader in the nonprofit world overcome and adapt to some of the challenging times that we're going through. We've got 2 great speakers this morning, and I'll introduce them to you in a minute, but I just want to take a moment to just kind of get our bearings of what we're looking at. I'm sure you've been on a Zoom call before, but here's what we're going to use throughout our time. We're going to go for about 45 minutes. We'll have both speakers share their perspective, and then we'll take some questions at the end. If you have a particular question for either of our speakers, feel free to put that in the Q&A widget that you should see at the bottom of your tray. And if you've got any words of encouragement, or I'll be asking some questions as we go through, feel free to put that into the group chat. Make sure you've got that open in front of you. Joan McBride has told us that there's a typo in this slide for the MP Collaborative website, so thank you for sharing that. It's there. The other thing final thing that I'd love for you to do is just to make sure that you've got somewhere to take some notes down, whether that's manual pen and paper, or perhaps your favorite note-taking app on your computer or your phone. What we really want you to do is to walk away with one or two really specific things that you can put in place in terms of your own leadership from each of those sessions. And so I'd just love for you to have a way to take notes as we go through today. And I'll encourage you to share some of your key takeaways as we're going through. But for now, let's move on to our first speaker. I have the pleasure of introducing Larry Tucker. Larry's a coach with Executive Coaches of Orange County. He's also in the leadership team there. He's been with the organization for a number of years. He's on the board of SCORE and just recently wrapped up a term as their chairman. He's a management consultant with Hewitt Associates and an avid touring cyclist. So I'm delighted to hand it over to Larry, who's going to share some thoughts on how to develop yourself. Over to you, Larry. You will need to unmute yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone. And thanks again, Dave. Appreciate the introduction. And I kind of wish I had kind of an Irish accent too. I think that would make the presentation so much better, you know. Welcome to our journey up the mountain to achieve greater leadership capabilities. As we start the journey, we want to personally develop the right mindset. So basically, how will we position our thinking and therefore our actions to succeed? Today, I'll share the definition of leadership that we use for the foundation of this discussion. Then we'll consider how specifically we adjust our thinking and actions to be good leaders. And then we'll finish with some tips on leadership during the pandemic. So here's the definition that the Center for Creative Leadership uses. Leadership is a social process that enables individuals to work together to achieve results that they could never achieve working as individuals. That's a great definition. There are a lot of definitions of leadership, but they mostly say the same thing, that we aren't managing or telling, but rather engaging in a social process to influence others, or role modeling. So we sometimes think of leadership in very broad, sweeping strokes, like Nelson Mandela, for example, influencing an entire country to end apartheid in South Africa. And that's great leadership. But leadership we practice every day is different, right? For us, leadership is exhibited through those dozens of individual discussions that we have every week, those often casual conversations with our team that you may not give much thought to. And that's where I'd like to direct your attention today. It is these words and actions that have the greatest influence over those around you. It's in preparing for these individual sessions where I'd like you to consider your mindset. What are you thinking about as you enter those conversations? Reflect back to your last encounter with a member of your team. You know, think about that for a second. What was it, to move a project along or to fix a project going off track? I'd like you to consider your intentionality when you talked with a member of your team. That is, what are you intending to accomplish with this conversation beyond the immediate issue at hand? From a leadership perspective, let's focus on two elements of intentionality: connecting to the mission and vision, and role modeling leadership characteristics. We too often assume that every employee understands their connection to the mission and vision of the organization, but that's often not the case. Like the rest of us, those around us get buried in our day-to-day duties and often don't see beyond the nearby trees. You may have heard the story of the fellow walking down a path in the 15th century when he eyed some people working. When he asked the first worker what he was doing, the worker said, "I'm breaking rocks." Further down the road, he asked the same question of a worker doing exactly the same thing. And that second worker answered, "I'm building a cathedral." We want our employees to see the cathedral. We really want our team to be engaged in the overall mission of the organization as deeply and continuously as possible. This doesn't mean we're lecturing about vision and mission during these conversations. The simple reference to why they are doing this project or why they need to follow a particular process, for example, links them to the greater good of the organization, which will help engage them further. For example, and this is simple, if you're working with an employee on a fundraising gala, you might say, "This event is important to our organization and to our community because if successful, we can purchase 5,000 more meals for the homeless." That sounds like an obvious connection, but sometimes we have to make those connections for employees. There are a lot of lists of great leadership characteristics. This graphic uses the list from the Center for Creative Leadership, which is one that I like. As I mentioned previously, a critical element of your leadership role is influencing or role modeling. As you enter into a discussion with a team member, what leadership characteristics do you need to exhibit in addressing the issues or topics you'll cover in that meeting? Again, this doesn't mean that we're lecturing. So let me give you a couple of simple examples on role modeling in the environment. You've probably done it before. In a meeting with an employee, you might say, let's say we've hit a snag in a project. In the meeting with that employee, you might say, "I know we could shortcut the solution here, but that shouldn't even be on our radar. We need to make sure that we take the time to do this right, even if it means delaying the results." Or maybe we want to model effective communication. You might say, "Let me sit down with you and spend some time sharing the background of this project and why it's so important to our organization and community." So keep in mind intentionality in those discussions. Let's talk a little bit then about leading in the pandemic. I actually talked with a series of for-profit and nonprofit leaders and asked them what their ideas or actions were that helped them through the pandemic. And I got these suggestions and realized that these suggestions probably will be appropriate even beyond the pandemic. So let me go through them with you and share some of the discussion I had with them. So number one was, don't break your routines. Eat well, sleep well, continue your exercise regimen. I know that's easier said than done, but try. Actively connect. I heard this a few times. The pandemic has required that many of our employees work remotely, but even those who are working in the office, make sure to connect often with your direct reports and maybe even other employees that you may not normally connect with. Don't wait for the anxious or panicked phone call. In fact, I've got my own bad example of this. As the chairman of the board of a national nonprofit headquartered on the East Coast, we started doing Zoom board meetings. After a month or two of Zooms, I received a surprise call from a board member who said she was resigning from the board because of an issue that we really hadn't discussed. She had already made up her mind about that. I really felt that a side discussion or two at an in-person board meeting would have definitely allowed us to have a thorough discussion before she had made her decision. But Zoom meetings just don't allow for that type of individual interaction. So I learned my lesson. In fact, I went ahead and set up individual Zoom calls with all the remaining board members, and I learned a lot from those. This is one I also heard a few times. Listen deeper. It's a little more difficult to read people's intentions and feelings on phone calls and Zoom. So ask more questions. Listen for signs of stress. At the very least, you might be able to offer some comfort or might be able to accommodate them in some way, or you might know of a resource to help them. Demonstrate empathy and gratitude. We are, after all, talking about people's health during this crisis. So, of course, it's very personal and very critical. Be understanding, try to accommodate, and don't forget to thank employees for their resilience through these last several months. They've been going through a lot. Look outward for support. In times of crisis, we tend to look inward. This is a great time to connect with your network of peers, at the very least to get emotional support and maybe even to understand what solutions that they've developed. I have two suggestions of reminders that are resources for you. And in fact, Dave mentioned these at the beginning. This is executive coaches of Orange County. Working with a coach at this point would probably make you feel less alone in your endeavors. A coach can share their own experiences and others' experiences, so you can learn from others to navigate the pandemic. So again, ECofOC offers no cost coaching, and so that's a neat resource. Also, as Dave mentioned, the Executive Director Forum program, where executive directors meet monthly. They do it now by Zoom to work through their issues and concerns. It's a great vehicle to get some technical and emotional support. You can apply for either a coach or the ED Forum or both at ECofOC.org. So in summary, sometimes leaders like you just need to be reminded of your leadership role, as we are ourselves climbing up the mountain, avoiding the crevices and navigating around the cliffs. We have to sometimes be reminded that we have people following us, and what we are signaling to those people is critical. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for that, Larry. Really appreciate that. Loved some of the top line items you had in there. Really loved the piece around intentionality and some of those tips for helping us to lead through the pandemic are hugely helpful. What I'd love for everybody on the call to do is just take a moment, take a minute and just think through what Larry shared with us and jot down on a bit of paper or your favorite note-taking app, just what are the one or two things that you're going to take away from what Larry shared with us. I'm just going to give you a moment to do that. As you're doing that, if you feel comfortable sharing with the wider group, would love to hear from you in the group chat. If there was a particular tip or hint or piece of information that Larry shared with us that is particularly helpful or useful for you, would love to hear from you in the group chat on what that might be. What are the one or two things that you're taking away with you? Heidi says we want our employees to see the cathedral. Yeah, I thought that was awesome, and just that link to the bigger mission. Stephanie says, listening deeply, my goodness, isn't that a skill that we could all develop at any point in our life? Thanks for sharing, Stephanie. I think that's a great one. What else are you taking away from what Larry shared with us? Cody says, one-on-one communication with key personnel is so important, especially as we're all separated. Absolutely. And that story, Larry, that you told about how you lost out on just those moments that you might have in person. Actively connect from Eve, making time to actively connect from Amy. That's awesome. Keeping routine from Michael, trying to keep some aspects of our day-to-day close to normalcy. I know what is normal anymore. Seeking support from Christine, routines from Janet, staying intentional and communication from Karen. Yeah, I think we're seeing a huge move towards intentionality in our workplaces and our organizations, and that's fantastic. And I would just challenge you with that takeaway. Maybe not right now, but certainly soon after we've finished this session, jot down what the specific behavior is. What are you going to do with it? When are you going to put that into practice? You know, we're often told that leadership is a soft skill and it's hard to practice. And actually, great leadership is just as hard a skill as learning to cook or learning to play the guitar. All it takes is for us to put in the hard work and to practice that. And I always encourage folks to look for the opportunity to put that into practice, to go do it, go implement, and then to review your progress. So thank you for sharing your takeaways from Larry's session. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Larry, for kicking us off. That was great. Delighted now to introduce our next guest. Gregory Gebhardt is a nonprofit financial consultant. He's a board member and chief operations officer for Fohrman and Fohrman Inc., which is a small firm specializing in CFO and accounting support services exclusively for nonprofits. Greg, great to have you with us, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you to everybody for joining today. And before I get started, thank you again to Executive Coaches of Orange County, Nonprofit Collaborative of Southern California, and Dave, to you, Steve, and the rest of the team behind the scenes. Thank you for all of your work putting this together and making this run so smoothly. You can go to the next slide there, Dave. Thanks. So as Dave mentioned, Fohrman & Fohrman provides accounting support, CFO services, and forensic accounting exclusively for nonprofits. And in my work with nonprofits, most of it is not focused on individuals, but on organizations, advising on financial management topics, building budgets, strategic plans, and that sort of thing. But given the topic today, I was interested in this question: how might organizational planning concepts help us develop as individual leaders? So for the next few minutes, I just want to take a look at two of the organizational planning concepts that are out there, and then explore some ideas on how we as individuals might be able to use them to become more effective and resilient. And then after that, we'll do the Q&A and wrap up for the morning. So our organizational concepts, sustainability as a balancing act. Sustainability is one of those buzzwords, and it can be a jargony term, but really what we're talking about here for nonprofit organizations is being effective over time. We're talking about long-term aspirational goals like ending homelessness or hunger for a nonprofit. And it involves a number of different factors, including financial strength, leadership succession, adaptability, and it can get very complex, but the main point to keep in mind is we're talking about being effective over time. Next slide. Thank you. So one way to think about or visualize this effectiveness over time is with this awesome graphic from the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and it shows three elements in a balance. The first is mission, which for a nonprofit organization, why we exist, who the organization serves, how we serve them. The next element is capacity, and that's the internal people, systems, and practices putting mission into action. And the third is capital, the resources needed for operations and growth. It's really money that we're talking about. These three elements are dynamic, meaning they change over time. They're always changing in one way or another. Those changes can be seen or unseen. They can be planned or unplanned. And the three elements are also interdependent, meaning that a change in one will impact the other two. For example, an organization that receives a large grant now has additional capital. They can now hire additional staff, thereby increasing their capacity, and hopefully they will be able to make a deeper mission impact. Keeping these three elements in balance over time requires vigilance. We're talking about effectiveness over time. So it's not so much like a one-time thing. Just because an organization has a strategic plan does not mean that it's sustainable. But really we're talking about this as being a practice or a habit. So let's go to the next slide, please. Keeping these three elements in balance for organizations is an iterative process, meaning that organizations need to constantly be evaluating this picture for themselves. And it all starts at the very top. There's no accident that mission is at the top of this triangle. Organizations who are practicing this or examining this balance should closely and honestly look at all of the elements together, as well as the context of the outside environment, And some questions that organizations can ask should be asking, what do we need to start, stop, or continue doing? What will we measure to know if our plan is working? Does our mission need to change? How do we define that effectiveness? How do we define impact on our mission? So this is a really quick view of the two main points here on the organizational side of things. Number one, this triangle of mission, capacity, and capital, and the balance between the three. And number two, that to keep them in balance requires an ongoing practice. It's not a one and done, it's an ongoing habit. So if we go back to this question and really the theme for today, how can we apply these 2 points and hopefully help us develop as individuals? Next slide, please. Thinking about us as individuals, we have beliefs, practices, and actions that help us hopefully make progress toward our larger goals and our values. We're thinking about our personal individual well-being and health. Larry mentioned several ideas related to this earlier. We, as individuals, can measure our impact and our effectiveness toward our own goals. And this means this could be personal goals, professional goals. We as individuals, I think, can think about our adaptability, resilience, and sustainability. Next slide. So thinking back to the triangle and the 3 elements in balance, what is your mission as an individual? What is your capacity? What systems or practices are you using now? What do you feel like you should start, stop, or continue doing? What might you want to outsource because someone else could do it easier than you could? And then finally, what resources do you as an individual need to operate and to grow? Taking this a little bit further and thinking about the second point, the ongoing process. Do you have regular time set aside for planning and for big picture thinking? Just like with our organizations, the big picture thinking, being able to frame our daily actions and decisions within the context of longer term goals, it's critical to our effectiveness and our resilience as organizations. I think it's the same with us as individuals. And Larry, again, mentioned this earlier, there's often so much going on day to day that's both important and urgent that the long-term planning gets put to the side. Same thing happens with our exercise or having healthy downtime. So some ideas for putting this into action: annual, quarterly planning days, a personal retreat, working day where you have some time set aside just for long-term thinking, putting it on the calendar and keeping yourself accountable. I know for me, that's often the most difficult thing. And other applications, using the triangle and the ongoing practice concepts. Can we apply this to ourselves in other ways? Possibly on a project, starting a big project, maybe thinking about mission, capacity, and capital, or relationships, our own personal relationships. There may be other applications. If you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. Further reading on this topic, boardsource.org if you're interested in more of the strategic planning tools or information or resources. And Stephen Covey, especially his book, First Things First. And also not listed here, Nonprofit Finance Fund, and obviously Executive Coaches of Orange County and the Nonprofit Collaborative. And that's it for me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate that. A lot of great stuff in there. I love just that structured approach to your own development and growth. So often in the craziness and the busyness of the day-to-day, we often just let that fall by the wayside. And whether it's professional growth or personal growth, I think it's really important to grab a hold of that. You had a slide in there that I'd love to go back to, because I'd like for everybody on the call just to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to give you 2 minutes here I'd love for you just to start to jot down your initial thoughts to some of these questions that Greg has here for us. What's your mission? What's your capacity right now? What systems and practices are you using that are helpful? What might be lacking? And what resources do you need to operate and grow at an individual level? Remember that today's session is all about developing yourself. So I want to give you just a couple of minutes time for internal reflection on these questions, and then I'll get some feedback. So I'll give you 2 minutes to do that. Last minute to reflect on these questions. I also think another good way to look at this is to take mission capacity and resources and just score yourself on a traffic light system. Is this a green light? This is something I'm really fired up with. I know what I've got it. I'm good. I'm firing on all cylinders. Is it a yellow or an amber light where it needs some tweaks? Or is it a red light that it's a big glaring gap for you? Because then that can really help you hone in on where you want to work on yourself. Final 30 seconds to do that. And then similar to what we did with Larry's session, would love to hear from you, taking what Greg just shared with us. What are your biggest takeaways? What are you going to put into place? What are you going to put into action? I already see the Barbara's put in here for leaders to stay flexible. I think that's great. What else are your biggest takeaways from what Greg just shared with us? Janet says, stop, start, and continue is essential. Yeah, I think that's such a great touch point on anything that we're doing, whether it's an individual level or organizational. We have a tendency to get so narrow vision and just lifting our head up. Scheduling time for those big picture thinking, like Jenny said, is hugely important. Thank you both for sharing. Joan says she loves the idea of the annual or quarterly planning days. I know we do them for our organizations, so why wouldn't we do them for ourselves? I think they're great, and we're coming up. Last quarter of this year is always a good time to begin to put some personal plans in for next year. Christine says she loves the personal retreat idea as well. Set aside personal time to think and plan long term. Absolutely, and maybe tie in a massage or a couple of hours by a pool or something as well.
That never hurts.
Thanks, Christine. For David, it's resources with regards to boards. That's great. Good takeaway for you. Appreciate that. Yes to self-care. Absolutely. Love all of these takeaways. I think they're great. I am going to stop sharing my screen. What I'd like to do, we've got... Okay, if you've got any questions, we're going to move into a period of Q&A for both Larry and Greg based on what they just talked about, or anything else in the world of self-care, leadership. I'd like for us just to spend a little bit of time making sure that your questions are answered. There's a specific Q&A widget. If you put it in there, that'll be super helpful because I can keep track of it in the Q&A widget. I've got a couple just to start us off. And the first one is for you, Greg. I was just thinking as you were talking through there around finding your mission, and I think it's hugely important. But if there's anybody on the call that just doesn't know what their mission is or where to even start, What thoughts do you have on that? How do we find our mission?
It's a great question. And not to be morbid, but one of my favorite exercises is from Stephen Covey. And one of his, he wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and one of the habits is to start with the end in mind. And one of the exercises is literally to start with our own end in mind and to visualize our funeral. And what are all the people at our funeral saying about us? You know,
Right.
what can we envision? What do we want them to be saying? What do we want our impact to have been in our lives? That can be a
Right.
very powerful exercise, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great, and great book. You know, one of those timeless classics. And I think that's fantastic. Start with the end in mind, and just build back from there. Larry, what about you? How important is the notion of mission to leaders in the nonprofit world? Where has this worked well, do you think?
Whereas what worked well, the
Having a strong personal mission.
having a strong personal mission. Actually, it's kind of interesting because we often do kind of forget about ourselves, and that happens a lot in the pandemic, and that's happening a lot in general, and especially during the pandemic when we are running from one thing to the next, and many things are happening that we kind of can't plan on. It is great, you know, it's much like an organization. It is great to be able to say, I've got this greater good in mind, and I've got these greater objectives in mind.
Right.
And so that helps, you know, especially in times of crisis, to be able to say, what are the things I really need to be focusing and working on? A lot of people don't do that. You know, one of the things we try to do as coaches, and I'm sure you would say this, Dave, is we really want to have people thinking about whatever it is that we would call them, objectives or goals or mission, right? Well, let's make sure that, and Greg made reference to this, let's make sure that folks are attacking the things that are most important for us, not the things that happen to be popping up that day.
That's great. Thanks, Larry. Joan has just said in the Q&A, I actually wrote a personal mission statement some years ago. I need to revisit again. I think it's really good to have a personal mission statement. Larry, I just want to stick with you for a minute. Melanie's got a great question here. She says, the pandemic has greatly reduced the number of volunteers, so capacity was suddenly impacted. How to re-engage?
Great question. How do we get our volunteers back? Is that basically the question?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is almost a marketing exercise, isn't it? It is outreach. It is connecting with as many people as we can. It is starting word of mouth and getting folks back in. I don't have a particular response for what's the best thing to do. But we know that, we know that getting volunteers is, I don't know, much like hiring employees for that matter, where a good way to hire employees is not necessarily to go online, but it's in fact to be able to reach out to various networks, find the right people, have the right conversations, to do it that way. And so I would suggest that for volunteers too.
Got it. Awesome. Some great questions here from Christine. Who are some inspiring leaders that you follow on social media? Any examples from your personal life of leading others or developing yourself? Greg, I'll throw that one to you. Anybody in particular that you like to follow?
There are plenty in terms of the finance and accounting side of things, but in terms of just personal leadership and being practicing compassion toward oneself, the author Pema Chodron is someone that I don't know how active she is on social media necessarily, but her writing is really powerful for me.
That's great. For me, I've always found Brendan Burchard pretty good in the personal development space. If anybody has to check him out, he's great. Cody says, we're all dealing with this pandemic and we're facing Zoom and other tech fatigue. I've taken more walks and baked more bread than ever before. What are some other more creative ways to make space for myself to relax and fuel the tank for continued growth? Larry, what are your favorite ways to relax? Any other ways for Cody?
You know what, before we get onto that, we were talking about leadership before and who do we follow? And I wanted to put in a plug for Nelson Mandela.
Okay.
And I just happened to include him in my talk, but if you read his autobiography, what an incredible story. Here is a guy that was in jail for 26 years and he comes out and he harbors no ill will about his captors and was able to role model working with both blacks and whites in South Africa. Wow. That is leadership. That is leadership. So I just had to mention that. And if you haven't had a chance to read that, great. Again, his autobiography, I can't remember the name of it, but his autobiography is terrific.
That's great. Thank you, Larry. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dave. Your question was?
What other great innovative ways to just relax and fuel the tank for continued growth?
I think, and I think Greg may mention this, but I think actually setting aside time in your calendar to make sure that you are not caught up in day-to-day things. I mean, just making sure that you set aside some time to do that and to relax. And in some cases, a lot of people like meditation. There are things like that that can really help.
That's great. Thanks, Larry. And I see some folks are putting in the group chat, art and jurors for Julie. Everyone is an artist. Love that. So get it engaged with some of the visual arts. Final question, and then we'll move to a conclusion. Comes from Mike. Says they're a new startup in nonprofit, started right before COVID, had a ton of positive momentum, but not a large following yet. Small board of director, 3 dads, all with full-time jobs. Any thoughts on expanding the board during COVID when they haven't fully gotten the traction they need on their mission? What are your thoughts on expanding the board during COVID when they haven't really gotten the traction they need on their mission?
That's actually, this answer is going to sound like others that I've given before, but what I have found is that board development is much like, again, it's much like marketing. It's much like looking for employees. It has to do with networking. It has to do, and so these days it's kind of networking through Zoom, but there might be situations that you can sit down and have a cup of coffee with folks. One of the things that I suggest to a lot of the folks that I work with is, it is great to be able to have conversations with folks that where they don't feel pressured. And so if you have conversations with folks and say, you know what, I don't necessarily think that you would be the right person for our board, but boy, you know so many folks, help me out here. Here's who I'm looking for.
Right.
And so, use a network of folks to as a way to get referrals.
That's great. Thank you, Larry. Really appreciate that. Well, folks, we are right at the end of our 45-minute session. Thank you, Larry and Greg, for your thoughts and your insights. We're just about to launch a poll. If you could take it, just hit an answer real quick for us, that would be awesome, just as we wrap up. So yes, the person that asked me if we can launch the poll, please feel free to do that now. That would be great. You'll see it right up in front of you now. Our next session is next week, same time, where we're going to be talking about how to develop a team, how to hire the right people, how to develop those people, so that they can deliver excellence for your organization, your clients, and your community. For now, huge thanks to our panelists. Thanks to ECofOC and MPC for putting this together. Thank you for Steve, who's run this in the tech. Thank you everybody in the group chat for being so awesome and engaging. We hope to see you next week for another session in this series of Reaching New Heights. For now, I wish you a great day and all the very best.